So, looking at muscle mechanics, some basic principles of how your muscle works. This again is just as a whole, you already know, cellular, how a muscle contracts. Anytime we talk about if we're affecting one single muscle fiber, that means we're also affecting the entire that whole muscle itself, not just the individual cell, but whatever's happening to the cell is also happening to the entire muscle. When we contract our muscle, we produce muscle tension, which is going to generate some type of force on a load or an object, whether you're trying to move a car or pick up a book or whatever it is. You're going to generate tension. You're going to exert some type of force on an object. Now, when we contract a muscle, it may or may not shorten. Generally, when people think of muscles contracting, you're thinking of doing this, and your muscles, your biceps are shortening. You can contract a muscle without it actually shortening as well. There's two types of contractions when we talk about muscles. One is known as isometric, the other is known as isotonic. Now, what does iso mean? It means the same. So an isometric contraction, so they're kind of looking at length versus tension. And so they just flip-flop in their names. So isometric, what do you think metric has to do with? Length or tension? Length. When you think you measure things in meters when you're looking at length. So an isometric contraction, the name means the same length. The actual muscle length is not changing. However, the tension behind it is changing. If I'm trying to push a car, and and it's in park, it's not even in neutral or anything, and I'm trying to push a car, I could push on it just a little tiny bit, or I can push on it a whole bunch. Either way, is that car moving? No. However, I can change my tension, how much force I'm pushing on the car, but my muscles are not changing length whatsoever because that object's not moving. That's an isometric contraction. An isotonic contraction, anything tone has to do with tension. So now we're saying the same tension, however, the length will change. So if I'm going to lift up a book, I'm lifting it up. It's the same book, same weight, no matter what I'm doing to it. Same amount of tension on that book if I'm lifting a book. But my muscle is changing length. So, the name says what's staying the same, which means the opposite will change. If it's the same length, that means the tension changes, whether you're putting a little bit of force on something or a lot. And isotonic is the tension is staying the same, but your length is changing. Now, the force and the duration of how long you can hold that contraction and how much force you put on it, that varies, and we'll talk about things that can vary that up as well. Now, a term, when we start talking about, we've already looked at a neuromuscular junction, and that's kind of coming back a little bit today. When we talk about how the nervous system is controlling the muscles, we're looking at something known as a motor unit. A motor unit is the nervous system controlling the muscle system. Yes, it will end in these neuromuscular junctions, but the definition, well, we'll get there, Mike. Other little points where we get actual definition of motor unit. Each muscle, so whether it's your biceps brachii or your triceps or your pectoralis, whatever, every muscle is served by at least one motor nerve. Not neuron, nerve. If you remember, you've got all these nerves coming out of the spinal cord everywhere. Now, when I say a motor nerve, what does that mean? Motor nerve? It's going to control movement, because that's what we're talking about today, is moving these skeletal muscles. So I've got a motor nerve that's going to cause some type of movement. Again, it's one of these big, huge bundles of nerves. What is a nerve? A whole bunch of axons, so it's like a whole bunch of nerves. So a motor nerve contains axons of up to hundreds of motor neurons. So you've got one nerve coming out of a spinal cord that's going to go, control some muscle somewhere. And in that one nerve, you can have hundreds of axons of hundreds of motor neurons inside of it. Now, at the end of each axon, we have axon terminals. Do you remember how many times they can branch? They branch up to 10,000. I mean, you might have like 3. Or you might have 10,000 little tiny terminal branches that come off of it too. So axons branch into terminals, and each one of those little axon terminals will form a neuromuscular junction somewhere in that muscle fiber. So kind of just looking at a big scope of the nervous system, you're going to have at least one motor nerve controlling a muscle, but you have to have at least one. That motor nerve has a whole bunch of hundreds of different axons of different neurons in there. And each of those have little terminals that branch to the point where you get, up to thousands. Now, what a motor unit is, we're going to simplify and we're just going to talk about one motor neuron. So one little motor neuron, it could be, one of the hundreds of these motor neurons, but I only care about one. One motor neuron, not a nerve, one neuron, and all the muscle fibers that it controls. Because at the end of that one motor neuron, it might have 3 axon terminals, it might have 10,000 axon terminals. But I'm looking at that one motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it controls. That's a motor unit. Now, some are smaller in number. Some will only control 2 or 3 muscle fibers. Some will control a whole bunch of muscle fibers. Generally, the smaller the number of muscle fibers that are, controlled by one motor nerve, the finer the control you have over those muscles. We don't want just all of these different little, axon terminals all over controlling, hundreds of different muscle fibers in that one muscle. You don't have as fine of control. Now, do you remember, I think I asked before, what part of the body you have the finest, fastest control of? Your eyelids. And so some of those, you might have your motor unit there, might have that one motor neuron, and it only controls maybe 2 or 3 little muscle fibers inside of the muscles that are in there. So you have really fine control. This is showing, here is a nerve, one of, the 31 pairs of nerves that come off the spinal cord. And yes, there are a whole bunch of neurons in there. What I'm looking at, I'm looking at that there's only like 2 neurons. And so I've got 2 different motor units. Again, it's one neuron. There's my motor neuron. And the muscle fibers it controls. How many muscle fibers is my motor unit 1, my purple, controlling? 2. It controls 2 different muscle fibers. How many muscle fibers is my motor unit 2 controlling? 3. They can change. And again, you might have hundreds. We're not going to draw all that. It looks messy. But a motor unit is just one neuron and how many muscle fibers it controls. And yes, it can branch a whole lot, and you can have lots of neuromuscular junctions in there, but just one motor neuron and then the number of muscle fibers that it controls. And they actually show a picture over on the right-hand side of some of those branchings of some of the motor units. Now, of the motor unit, the muscle fibers that are controlled by a motor unit usually are spread throughout the muscle. So if you notice even on this picture, are the muscle fibers that are controlled by, say, motor unit 1 all right next door to each other? No, it's like, well, that muscle fiber way on the top is, these 2, there's still some in between. These 2 are spread out. And so I'm like, we don't want all the muscle fibers in one tiny little part, all controlled by the same motor unit. I'm like, this way we can have one small, if that one motor unit's activated, we're going to have one small weak contraction of the entire muscle. It's kind of spread out. So all of a sudden, if I'm just talking about biceps, I don't just have the top of my biceps contracting, with one tiny little thing. I'm like, different muscle fibers throughout that muscle are going to contract at the same time. I'm like, so it's just, the whole thing will contract very weakly if you only have one motor unit. And motor units usually contract asynchronously, which means? Different time, because you have the A in the front of it. So without synchronization, it helps prevent fatigue. So you don't have all of your muscle fibers all contracting all at once, and then they're like, oh, we're done. We usually can send different motor units, and they're like, okay, you guys contract, and okay, now you guys contract, and while the other ones are resting. So generally not every single one of your muscle fibers are activated at the exact same time. Motor units don't like to all send their information at the exact same time, so you're always contracting different muscle fibers in that muscle. Now, a muscle twitch, it's something we can see in a lab, is when, electrically we can send information to one motor unit. Now, generally we don't control just one motor unit. When we tell our muscles to contract, lots of motor units are activated. In a lab, they can make it so just one motor unit is activated. It causes those muscle fibers to contract, and then they relax. And we can see that happen in a lab. They're not going to visually see a muscle contract. Generally, when you just activate one motor unit, the contraction is so weak you're visually not going to see it. In a lab, they can record it, that it's actually happening, but we generally don't see it. The record that they look at is known as a myogram. What does that mean? Yeah, it's a muscle record. And I'm like, anything gram just is a record of something. And so they look at it, and I'm like, and oops, here's my picture of it. They notice, I'm like, here, I send one single stimulus. I've activated one motor unit. They can visually see the tension increase in that, in the muscle fibers that are activated, and they can see it relax. So that's just a little myogram showing that we see a contraction, we see a relaxation. Now there are 3 phases that happen in a muscle twitch. When you activate a motor unit, there's a little bit of time period after you activate those muscles that are activated before you can actually see any tension generated. Last time we talked about all the things that have to happen for a muscle to contract. We've got to move those action potentials. We have to release calcium. Calcium has to find troponin. It has to move the tropomyosin. Then the myosin heads can attach. That takes time. Not a lot of time, but it takes time. So when we send information before that muscle contracts, that's the latent period. And I'm like, so when we look at this, we sent the information here, but we don't actually start seeing any muscle tension changing whatsoever. It's right there. So that's our latent period. It takes a little bit of time for all that stuff to happen inside the cell. Then you actually have the period of contraction, all those cross bridges, all those myosin heads grabbing on and doing their power stroke. You're going to see tension in that muscle increase. And then after we've contracted and done our contraction, we need to reset ourselves. You've got the relaxation. All that calcium that was floating around that was released has to get sent back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the tension's going to go back down to 0, and your muscle relaxes. Now, my little note, a muscle will contract faster than it relaxes. You can see that, how fast it takes for a muscle to contract in just the little blue part. But for everything to reset itself, it takes a whole lot longer to get back to normal, which works to our benefit. I'm like, when we need an instantaneous reaction, we need to be able to, slam on the brakes or grab something or pull your hand away. You need that muscle to contract very, very quickly. And it just takes a little bit longer for everything to reset itself. But it works to our benefit. It would be a bummer if it went the opposite, and it would take a long period for that muscle to contract. Now, some differences or comparing some of these muscle twitches. There are different strengths, there are different durations of these muscle twitches between people, between muscles in the body. Different muscles in the body, and we'll get into different types of muscles later. I'm like, some have different enzymes, some have different metabolic processes, some make ATP different ways, some make it more efficiently different ways. And I'm like, that can change how fast those twitches are and how long that contraction is. But generally, the only time you're ever going to visually see a muscle twitch, even though it would still only be in the lab, is when you've got neuromuscular problems that they're going to go in and, they can control just one motor unit. Again, this is when I was talking to my old coworker who has the Lou Gehrig's disease, the ALS, and I'm like, that they would have to go in and do all this to him. I feel so bad. But I'm like, generally you're only going to see muscle twitches in a lab. They record it on the little myogram. Otherwise, your normal muscle contractions are nice and smooth. It's not just a quick contraction, relaxation. Even you're still not going to see a whole thing happen. Normally, our muscle contractions are very smooth. We activate lots and lots of motor units all at one time. Now, this is kind of my little thing saying some muscle twitches are faster than others in different parts of the body. I've got 3 different muscles here. I've got one extraocular muscle. Where do you think you find that? Yeah, around the eye. If you remember, you had those extrinsic eye muscles around the eyes that allows you to look up and around, left and right and up and down. The gastrocnemius, where's that? That's your calf. The soleus, where's that? Yeah, right underneath, right behind that gastrocnemius. I'm like, certain muscles in your body, their twitch, how fast they contract and relax are different, just depending on where they are in the body, the size of them, how they get their energy sources. But yes, those muscles around your eyes, they can contract and relax very, very quickly. Your gastrocnemius muscle, your big calf muscles, can also contract pretty quickly and relax pretty quickly. Your soleus muscle underneath, it contracts really slow and it relaxes really slow. It's kind of just like a lazy muscle. Normally it has to do with calcium levels and potassium levels, that there's usually something wrong in there. A lot of it is calcium levels that actually kind of causes your muscle to contract and you can't relax it. So a lot of time with Charlie horses they say, eat a banana, make sure your potassium levels are correct, and drink some milk. Yeah. Even though you've got excess calcium release, but it's usually ion. I know, and I'm like, part of it, it also has to do, if you're dehydrated, that seems to trigger it, and you have to drink more water in pregnancy. Part of it is extra weight on the muscles, that you're making your muscles work a little bit more than when you didn't have the extra weight there. There's lots of things that can trigger it, and some people are just more prone to it. Yay. It's been a while since I've had one, knock on wood. Now, looking at different muscle responses, we call these graded muscle responses. Again, graded because we're going to have some type of change happening. Now, our muscles respond to varying strengths of contractions, or our muscles can vary in strength of contraction for different types of demands. So your muscle can contract really strong, it can do a little weak contraction, but there are different things that are going to trigger that strength of contraction. Now, no matter what, if we're going to move our bones, we need some type of control. We just don't always want these fast, rapid movements all over our body, and we don't move in jerky motions. So we're going to have to try to control these muscle contractions. And so it's nice, smooth, flowing motion. I'm not just jerking my way all around up here. It'd be funny to watch. So, our muscles respond to kind of two different things. The frequency of stimulation. How fast are we sending information to our muscles to contract? We're going to talk about that one first. And the strength of the stimulation. Am I sending a really strong stimulus, like, holy cow, we better contract really fast, because this is a really strong stimulus, really strong nervous system information sending to the muscle? Or is it just a tiny weak one, like, whatever, we'll contract whenever? So it's how fast and how strong that contraction is. So first we're going to look at the frequency, how fast that information is coming from our nervous system to our muscles. Now, if you have just one single stimulus, one little action potential that goes to your muscles, this is when we get that basic twitch. We have, a little bit of latent period in there, it contracts, it relaxes, it's done. One single type of information will cause one small little contraction and we're done. The interesting stuff becomes, when you start to get more than that one single stimulus, because generally, unless you're in a lab, that you don't just get one single tiny little stimulus getting sent to your muscles. Mm-hmm. Like you're getting twitchy. It's very similar, and it's one of those, I'm like, when you can actually see your muscles twitch, they are contracting. It's not completely the same as this, only because this is only one muscle fiber contracting, and you visually wouldn't see it. Generally, when you see muscles twitch, you're activating multiple muscle fibers. It's kind of the same thing. You kind of get just these quick little, information sending to the muscles, even though you don't want it to. But since you're activating more than one motor unit and more than one muscle fiber, and you can see it, it's not completely the same. I don't know. I'm like, it could be stress. Again, it kind of goes with the Charlie horse. I'm like, it could easily be ion imbalances, dehydration, things like that. Again, there's multiple things that can set up twitches. I know. Yay. Now, if we start to increase that frequency of stimulation, so it's not just one information, one contraction, we're done, we get something that's known as wave or temporal summation. What does it mean, sum, when you're summing something? You're adding them up. And I'm like, so if you have to give me the sum of something, we're adding them up. So now we're increasing the stimulus frequency, which means the muscle does not completely relax before all of a sudden you send information along. Now, what ends up happening is the muscle is, starting to relax, and all of a sudden we send more information. That second contraction is actually of greater force than the original contraction. This is the summing part. As it starts to relax, we send in our information, and now we get a stronger contraction. What ends up happening, is we released all that calcium to cause that contraction, and it's starting to slowly go back in. When you send that second information, we release even more calcium, so you can have a stronger contraction. It allows us to produce smooth, flowing, continuous contractions. We can easily control our muscle, so it's not just a quick, twitch and you're done. It's like, okay, let's activate all these different things. I can smooth it, and I can move my muscles nice and slow, nice and smooth, because as one things are trying to relax, I can produce another contraction, and it kind of all works together that we're just producing, stronger forces, bigger contractions, and it works well. Now, can you see why they call it wave summation? Because it looks like waves. So this is just showing you have a single stimulus. It causes the muscle to contract. As it's starting to relax, it's like, oh, just kidding. Here's more information getting sent. And now you have a stronger contraction. As it starts to relax, again, you can send more information, and we start to get stronger and stronger contractions. Yes, there is a point where, you can't get any stronger contraction. But it's cool that the second stimulus or the third stimulus will create a stronger contraction. Now, bodybuilders also use this to their advantage. Have you ever seen someone do those deadlifts? And I'm like, what do they generally do first? They kind of usually bounce a little bit even, or kind of go down and then throw it up. A lot of what they're doing is kind of creating that initial, let's get that muscle working. They're creating that wave summation so that you can get that strong, force behind it. Now, if you have just constant stimulus, no relaxation whatsoever, there's absolutely no relaxation, you've got your muscle contracted, there's just stimulus constantly going, we call it fused tetani. Anything teton or tone has to do with tension, it literally means that tension does not change. It is that muscles contract and there is no relaxation whatsoever. Now, different kind of, and I'm like, most people think when they hear of tetani, they think, oh, like tetanus, you get your tetanus shot. Tetanus, tetanus itself, if you ever seen or known anyone that's actually been afflicted with tetanus, they didn't get shots or anything like that, it causes muscle contractions to the point that your muscle will stay contracted, they literally call it lockjaw, like you can't release your muscles in your cheeks. It's similar to what's happening. But when they're talking about complete tetani, it just means that muscles contracting, it's holding a contraction, and it's not relaxing. So you can have a smooth, sustained contraction. I can hold something, and I'm not moving at all. So it's a nice, smooth, held contraction of something. However, because the muscle is not relaxing anywhere in there, it will cause muscle fatigue. Eventually, at some point, your muscle's going to give out. If I tried to hold the book by my arm out like this, I could do it for a short period, but eventually that muscle is going to give out and I'm going to drop whatever's in my hand. Yes, and your arms feel like they're going to fall off. Now, so that was looking at the frequency of stimulation. Now, when we look at how strong that stimulus is and how the muscle changes, we're going to look at it's known as recruitment. It's kind of like how strong that stimulus is compared to how many muscle fibers we're going to activate. So when we talk about it as recruitment, I'm recruiting something. What I'm recruiting are motor units. It's like how many motor units, which are going to control different muscle fibers, are activated. So the different forces or strengths of stimulus, one we call it a sub-threshold stimuli. You can send a really weak stimuli to the muscle. If it's weak enough that it doesn't hit what's known as threshold, you're not going to have any contraction whatsoever. There are some electrical stimuli sending information to your muscles, and your muscles are like, whatever, it's not strong enough, we're not going to do anything about it. That's just called subthreshold, no muscle contraction. Threshold stimuli, which means you're going to have enough or a strong enough stimuli that you're going to see a muscle contraction. A maximal stimuli means the absolute strongest stimulus where your muscle can't contract anymore. It's like, I have contracted, every muscle fiber is doing its job, I cannot do anything else. It doesn't matter how strong of a stimuli, you can keep increasing that stimulus. I'm like, if you're hooked up to a little electrical zapper, you can keep increasing that voltage, your muscle can't do any more. That's the maximal stimulus. At some point, there's some electrical information, max, where your muscle can't respond any different. I've got a picture that'll show that coming up. Hold on. Now, my little note, a muscle will contract more vigorously as the stimulus increases, as long as we hit threshold. Well, as long as you hit threshold, the stronger the stimulus, the stronger the muscle contraction. Kind of makes sense? As long as you hit threshold, the stronger the stimulus, the stronger the muscle contraction. The contraction force, that your muscle's going to do is precisely controlled by recruitment. How many muscle fibers are activated? Again, is it one muscle fiber is activated, or is it 100 muscle fibers are activated? And beyond what's known as that maximal stimulus, your muscles cannot contract beyond, you can't generate any more force, and you're only as strong as you are. Yeah, you can eventually change that as you muscle building, but you're only as strong as you are. It doesn't matter how much information you give your muscles, you can only lift. You know, if you're like, I can only lift 100 pounds, that's, you know, your maximal. It doesn't matter what information you send it, you can only lift 100 pounds. There is a maximal stimulus. So, I like this picture, Mike, because this is looking at the stimulus voltage, how many motor units are activated, and the tension you can generate. So if I have a stimulus 1 or 2, these are 2 really weak stimuli, which means they don't meet threshold, which means I have not activated any motor units. I always like to think of these as little muscle fibers. I have not activated any muscle fibers whatsoever, which means I have not done anything. I have not contracted. I have not generated any tension if I haven't hit threshold. If I have a strong enough stimulus where I have hit threshold, that means you've at least activated a couple muscle fibers or motor units, and you've generated a little bit of tension. Not a lot, but you did. As you start to increase that stimulus, so the stronger the voltage, you're going to activate more motor units, and your tension is going to increase. But at some point, once you hit with, you know, on here my maximal stimulation is 7, whatever voltage this is, I have activated every muscle fiber in my muscle. So my entire muscle is trying to contract. It doesn't matter if I increase the stimulus after that. Does not matter if I keep increasing it. Are there any other muscle fibers to recruit? No, not at all. And so this is what's known as your maximal contraction. It's like, you know, I can only lift 100 pounds. This is it. It doesn't matter if you keep shocking or probing with some electricity to your muscles. Your muscles can't respond anymore. They've activated every muscle fiber that's there. And I'm like, it's your maximal contraction. Now, recruiting all these different muscle fibers works on a size principle. The motor units that work with the smallest number of muscle fibers are recruited first. Our body likes to be as lazy as possible. So it's one of those, if I have a small stimulus, I'm not going to activate that one motor unit that controls 100 different muscle fibers. It's like, whatever, small little bit of stimulus, I'm going to activate the smallest motor unit that only maybe activates 2 or 3 muscle fibers. The motor units that have larger and larger fibers and control more and more fibers, they only get recruited as the stimulus intensity increases. Again, we're lazy. Let's recruit the smallest fibers, the smallest number of fibers before we start to recruit the bigger ones. That's like, why contract a bigger muscle when we don't have to? So the largest motor units are activated only for the most powerful contractions. So this is, again, just showing if you have, you know, we're always just going to activate the motor unit that controls the smallest muscle fibers. Eventually, when you start to get stronger and stronger contractions, you'll start to activate and try to contract larger and larger muscle fibers. It just goes by size. Our body wants to be as lazy as possible, just like we do. Now, a little bit more about my isotonic contractions. Based on its name, what does it mean? Same tension, so does it change length? Yes. So it changes length, because it's always the opposite. So same tension, length changes. So a muscle changes in length to move some type of load, whether it's a book, whether it's a car, whether it's, I don't know, whatever. My thin filaments, my actin, are going to be sliding past each other because my muscle length is going to change. Now, there are 2 types of isotonic contractions. Know these 2 different ones? Concentric contractions and eccentric contractions. Most people think and are most familiar with the concentric contraction. The muscle will shorten when it does work. Most people think, all right, I want to pick up a book. To do that, I need to shorten that muscle to do work. However, when I want to push a car because it's dead, our muscle's shortening when you're pushing on the car. No, that's an eccentric contraction. You're doing work when you're trying to lengthen those muscles. It's also the same thing, so when you're trying to push on something, it's also the same thing if I had a really heavy book, another example of an eccentric contraction. So I can do a concentric contraction. I can shorten all my muscles to lift it up. However, I want to set the book down. I don't want to drop the book. I want to set this heavy book down. I'm also generating force by lengthening that same bicep that I just shortened. Mike, this is also one if you've ever gone to weightlifting classes or any type of workout, whatever. They're like, oh, we're not just going to lift something up. We also want you to slowly I'm like, bring it back down before you push it up, whatever it is. And I'm like, because when you're going the opposite direction, you're also generating force. You're also getting a workout doing that opposite, lengthening the muscle. So it's not constantly just pushing it. If you're pushing a barbell, it's not just constantly pushing it up and just dropping it. You want to be able to slowly, drop the barbell down or whatever it is, because you're still generating force. That's an eccentric contraction. You're still generating force when a muscle lengthens. This is kind of just showing an isotonic contraction. My tension stayed the same. I'm still lifting a 3 kilogram block. However, my muscle shortened. It's an isotonic contraction. This would be an example of a concentric contraction. I don't have a picture of an eccentric contraction. This is just another one showing, that's what you would visually see. In a lab, what they're looking at is the length of the muscle has gotten shorter. I went from this long down to this long, but the muscle tension stays the same. I'm like, it's still that same weight that you're trying to lift. Now, an isometric contraction, based on its name, what does it mean? Same length, but what changes? The tension can change. So an isometric contraction, the load is greater than the tension that the muscle can develop. How do I say it? I'm like, let me think of my example that I had. Oh, I'm like, your muscle is going to stay the same length, but your tension can change. My example, if I'm trying to push a car or, lift something that's too heavy, again, I can, briefly try to lift it, or I can really try to lift it. I can change the tension. Either way, if it's too heavy for me to lift, my muscle's not going to shorten. So my tension can increase up to my muscle's capacity, but if it's too much for whatever it is, the muscle won't shorten, and it's not going to lengthen, and that car's not moving anywhere. So my cross bridges, I'm still going to have myosin grabbing onto actin. That's what's going to generate the tension, but it's too much. The tension's too much. I can't actually move those myosin heads. I can't shorten the muscle itself. I'm not going to shorten any sarcomeres, but I can generate tension by myosin heads grabbing onto actin. This is showing resting length in an isometric. Length does not change. I can change how much tension I push on it. You've probably at some point had something where you're like, let's all work together and push on the car. And there's someone in the group that's like, whatever, I'm just going to walk along, pretend I'm pushing it. They're not generating a lot of tension where you might, really be struggling. Just different tensions that you want to push. Now, muscle tone. First, have you heard of muscle tone? Everyone's like, oh, I really want to be toned up, and I want some really good muscle tone, and you didn't really know what that meant. What a muscle tone means is that your muscles are always in a constant, slightly contracted state. So your muscles are always slightly contracted. It works out well, because when your muscles are slightly contracted, they're usually shortened, they stick out a little bit, and you look like you've got good muscle definition, because you can see those contracted muscles. Now, the muscle tone, having those slightly contracted muscles all the time, it's due to spinal reflexes are telling information through those motor units to, always be contracting some of the muscle fibers. Reason why it's good, although most people like it because it visually looks good, because now you can see your muscles. It keeps your muscles firm. They stick out, they're tightened. Healthy, because they're constantly being used, and they're ready to respond. I'm like, if you need to all of a sudden sprint and half your muscles are already halfway contracted, you're like, well, I'm halfway there. Faster than someone that's just, slacking and they have weak muscles and they aren't doing anything. If your muscles are already slightly contracted, you're like halfway there to that, to do whatever it is that you need to do. So it's good to have good muscle tone. But now when people are talking about muscle tone, what that means is your muscles are always just slightly contracted. Now, where they get all of this energy for contraction? The biggest energy source for contraction is ATP. So we need ATP. ATP is needed to, move and detach those myosin heads. We need ATP to help pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We need ATP to move sodium and potassium back where it needs to go using that sodium-potassium pump. We need ATP everywhere. For muscles to contract, for muscles to relax, we need ATP. We only have enough molecules of ATP in our body at any given point. If your muscles need to work hard, for your muscles to work about 4 to 6 seconds. That's it. So we need to be able to make ATP as fast as, or nearly as fast as, how fast our muscles can use it when our muscles are contracting it. So there are 3 different ways we can generate ATP. One is your anaerobic pathway, which means you're missing what? Oxygen. So when you don't have oxygen present, this should look familiar. Glycolysis, we're splitting sugar, it goes into something known as pyruvic acid, and it makes a byproduct of lactic acid when there's no oxygen. Aerobic respiration, when you have lots of oxygen present, and a substance known as creatine phosphate. It's a high energy molecule that we store in our muscles. People that are bodybuilders you can drink creatine phosphate or creatine. It's just an energy source that our muscles can use really well to help generate some of the ATP in your muscles. These are kind of the 3 ways we can try to generate ATP as fast as we use it. We're going to look at each of them a little bit. Creatine phosphate, I don't think we look at a whole lot. We're going to look at the anaerobic pathway. Again, this is that glycolysis. Where does glycolysis take place? Yeah, outside the mitochondria in that cytoplasm. We take one glucose molecule, we split glucose in half. That's what the name glycolysis means. It's breaking down of sugar. And it makes 2 molecules known as pyruvic acid. Now normally, if there's oxygen present, those 2 pyruvic acids head into the mitochondria and undergo aerobic respiration. However, we're in our anaerobic pathway and we have no oxygen present, so that those pyruvic acid molecules are going to get converted into lactic acid. And we'll talk about it's not all bad. We can still use lactic acid. Now, at about 70% of your maximum contractile activity, you are using about 70% of your muscles. So not all of them, but a large majority of your muscles. What ends up happening when all of a sudden you're contracting that many muscle fibers, those bulging muscles, even though you're breathing oxygen, if you hooked up to an oxygen tank, when you're activating that many muscles, the muscles bulge out and they actually compress your blood vessels. So even though you could be taking in straight oxygen, what you're doing is you're cutting off oxygen supply to your muscles when you use your muscles that fast. So even if you're hooked up to oxygen and you're doing a sprint, it does not matter. Your bulging muscles are going to compress blood vessels and you are now in an anaerobic environment, even though you're breathing oxygen. Now that lactic acid, the stuff that will make you sore, is not all bad. Lactic acid, made from that pyruvic acid, it goes into the bloodstream. It is a fuel source. I mean, it did come from sugar. It came from the breakdown of sugar. So it is a fuel source. The liver can use it as fuel. The kidneys can use it as fuel. The heart can use it as fuel. Eventually, we can actually convert that lactic acid into pyruvic acid. We can do this whole process in reverse. We can take lactic acid, put it back and make it back into pyruvic acid, and we can even back it up even further and turn it right back into glucose, into that sugar in the liver. And so it is an energy source. We can use it at different parts of the body, and we can reverse that lactic acid. Now, my little note with anaerobic respiration, it only yields about 5% as much ATP as an aerobic respiration. So if you remember, back when we did cellular respiration, how many ATP does glycolysis give you? 2. How many ATP does the Krebs cycle with the electron transport chain? Yeah, and I'm 30, 32, 36, whatever, somewhere around 30. So the anaerobic glycolysis only gives you about 5% of ATP compared to what aerobic respiration can do. However, even though it's not a lot, it can make ATP 2.5 times faster than that aerobic respiration. So it doesn't give you a lot, but you can make it really, really quick. And so again, we can use this anaerobic, process to make really fast ATP for short bursts of energy. I was going to say, I know I've got a picture somewhere else coming out showing the differences. It's usually about 30 to 40 seconds. You can do any type of muscle contractions in an anaerobic environment for about 30 to 40 seconds. So you can do a quick sprint for about 30 to 40 seconds in an anaerobic environment. Otherwise, your muscles are going to have to switch somehow and get some oxygen. Otherwise, they go into muscle fatigue. So the aerobic pathway, where you get the majority of your ATP, because now we're in the mitochondria. Again, it makes most of the ATP when your muscles are at rest, or if they're just doing a slow, moderate amount of exercise. It is a slow process, not as fast as anaerobic. It requires oxygen, hence the name aerobic. Happens in the mitochondria. Again, we're breaking down glucose, our byproducts, carbon dioxide, water, and a whole bunch of ATP, at least 30. So I'm like, this little review. The fuel sources for making ATP using the aerobic pathway, a lot of it is glucose, the stuff that gets in your bloodstream. We also have stored glycogen that we have stored in our muscles, in our livers. It's an energy source that we can break down and make ATP. We've got pyruvic acid that came from glycolysis. If you have oxygen present, we had glycolysis that made pyruvic acid that made it into the mitochondria, as well as free fatty acids. Some of these might be fatty chains that came from phospholipids. It might be from some of your diet when we start breaking down some of the fats in your diet. But we've got fats that have lots and lots of energy. So it's not always just sugar. There's other molecules of energy that we can break down and make ATP. This is just kind of showing, different energy sources, fatty acids. You can even get some energy source from amino acids. Where are those from? Proteins. You can get energy from protein, as well as sugar that you get done eating. It gets broken down to the pyruvic acid, goes into that mitochondria. It makes 32-ish, give or take, ATP, as well as some byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. We need oxygen once we've gotten to this process. Just the breakdown of this, you don't need oxygen. That's the anaerobic part. That's the glycolysis part. Now, some energy systems, that use one or the other a little bit better. One is aerobic endurance. This is just how long your muscle can contract using an aerobic pathway. Now, any guess how long that can be? How long can your muscles contract? That's anaerobic. I was going to say, good on that one. What about aerobic, if you have oxygen present? Hours. Marathon runners, they can run for hours. And I'm like, in aerobic endurance, and I'm like, it's a slow run. You're not doing a sprint. But those muscles can contract for long periods of time, as long as you have oxygen present. But at some point, I'm like, your muscles are going to hit what's known as an anaerobic threshold. And I'm like, for some of us, you run for 5 minutes. And you're like, oh, I've hit my anaerobic threshold, now I'm switching to, or I've hit my aerobic threshold, now I'm switched to anaerobic, and now you're sore after running 5 minutes. Marathon runners can run hours before they hit what's known as the anaerobic threshold, before they become sore. And I'm like, other people it's 5 minutes, other people it's 2 minutes. I can run for 2 minutes, and then I'm sore after that. It's just known as the anaerobic threshold. At some point, there is a time period where you go from aerobic respiration to anaerobic respiration, and with that anaerobic, you're going to make lactic acid. Here's my one picture showing short duration exercises, your basic sprint, all anaerobic. Again, it lasts about 30 to 40 seconds. You can do any type of activity, 30 to 40 seconds without a lot of oxygen, and you're done. And after a sprint, if you've ever sprinted, like really sprinted, you're sore the next day. I still remember I did softball one day. I didn't stretch, and I ran to first base. I was sore for like 4 days just from running to first base. A lot of shape. Hours, though. If you're doing a slow, prolonged exercise, as long as you have oxygen present, I'm like, you can make enough ATP to keep you running for hours. That's that aerobic respiration. Again, anaerobic, 2 seconds, and you're done. Now, at some point, you're going to get to what's known as muscle fatigue. This doesn't just mean, oh, I'm tired. This means your muscles physically cannot contract anymore. It doesn't matter if you're telling your muscles to contract. Most of you feel fatigue, but if you need to, you can get up and go get a drink of water or whatever. This is the point, muscle fatigue. It doesn't matter. I'm telling your muscles, you're telling your muscles to contract, like, I need to get up now. And you physically cannot. Your muscles can no longer contract. Now, that doesn't mean because there's no ATP anymore. Like usually somewhere, you're making ATP somewhere. It usually has to do with the fact that you've, got ion imbalances between your sodium and potassium. You've run out of calcium stores. It's, usually a lot of ion loss. This you may see after people have done marathons that aren't the best trained. They get to that finish line, they literally, sometimes it's mental, they don't even control their muscles anymore. They fall over. I've seen people that I'm like, they just literally fall across the finish line. and they have to get carried away because they physically cannot stand up and move anymore. They've got complete muscle fatigue. Their muscles cannot move. Now, after you do exercise, you're all like, yeah, I'm going to go run that marathon. After you do exercise, to help you get back to that resting state, your oxygen reserves do need to get replenished. So, if you've got an oxygen tank, call up grandma. Next to you, I'm like, that helps. And I'm like, you can get some extra oxygen in your body. It helps reset everything. That lactic acid that started to build up eventually has to get converted back to pyruvic acid. That may take several days. That's the days you're sore afterwards. If you've got a large oxygen supply, it goes a little bit faster. You're not sore as long. Your glycogen stores, that stored energy, all needs to get replaced. You need to be eating, fueling yourself back up. All of your ATP and your creatine phosphate reserves all need to get replenished. Again, you need to eat, just rest, your body. So all require extra oxygen, and this all occurs after you're done. You need to be able to reset your muscles to get back to normal. Now, during muscle activity, you are also producing heat. That's not anything new, unless you're like, oh, it makes sense now. About 40% of the energy that's released in muscle activity is used as work. That's it. When your muscles contract, it's not like 100% of the energy that came out of those muscle contractions actually moves you from point A to point B. Only about 40% of the energy in that muscle contraction actually makes you move. The other 60% of the energy is given off as heat. We're not very efficient. Cars are even less efficient than we are. So we're not very efficient. 60% of all the energy that we're burning up gets given off as heat, which is why when you work out, you get hot. When your muscles are contracting, you get hot. Now, as your body heats up, you should be able to sweat to help cool you down. Your face starts to turn red because you're trying to release some of that heat from your blood to the surface of the skin. And we can also use that to our benefit because if you're cold, that shivering is muscles contracting, trying to generate extra heat. So we can use it to our benefit as well. All right, some review. We're going to go through. I'm like, don't even get your color no colors out because time-wise, I still got more to get through. Just say it. Small, precise movements are controlled by what number of motor units? It is the small motor units. So small movements, small motor units. A muscle contraction increases in strength up to a point because then what happens? I guess and then what happens? It's just because, a muscle contraction increases in strength up to a point because you're recruiting more and more motor units. An isometric contraction, same length, comes into play when an individual is doing what? That's changing length. Good dream. Maintaining an upright posture. If I'm standing here, I'm not moving. Are muscles contracting? Yeah, otherwise I'd fall over. So I still have muscles that are staying contracted and they're not moving length because I'm not moving, but it helps you stay there and not fall over in your chair. A sprinter is likely to depend on what type of respiration to generate ATP, and a Tour de France cyclist is likely to rely on what type of respiration? It's pink. Sprinter, anaerobic, really fast energy, short periods of time. Tour de France, when you're biking for hours and days, needs aerobic respiration. All right, on to my last part. Force of muscle contraction. So when we're generating lots of force, I'm lifting something really heavy. Again, it depends on the number of cross bridges that are attaching, the number of myosin heads attaching to actin. Now, that force changes or is affected by 4 different things. Now, I'll briefly talk about each of these more, I think, on my next slide. The number of muscle fibers that I stimulate, that's the recruitment. The size of the muscle fibers, how big are your muscles? The frequency of stimulation, the faster the stimulation, the stronger the force. And how stretchy your muscles are when you start telling them to contract. So the first one is that number of muscle fibers. The more muscle fibers that are recruited, the more force you can generate. Make sense? The more muscle fibers you recruit, the greater the force, the heavier the object you can lift. The relative size of your muscle fibers. Your muscle fibers, do the number of muscle fibers ever change? No. But the myofibrils that are found inside the muscle fibers, they can increase in number. And I'm like, so you can have big muscle fibers, big muscles, or small muscle fibers. You just don't have as many myofibrils in there. So the bulkier or bigger of the muscle, we call it the hypertrophy of cells, bigger cells, the more force. When you're a weightlifter, you've got huge muscles, you can generate more force, correct? You've got bigger cells to be able to lift something up. That's size of fibers. The frequency of stimulation, we already kind of said that. The faster you're sending information, the more force you can generate. That's that wave summation. And something known as length-tension relationship, which if you take advanced, you do a lab on this in one of your labs. Your muscles can contract the strongest when they are right about resting length. Not a whole lot, so anywhere between 80 and 120%, so about resting length. Now, one of the things you'll do, and I'm like, I know which machine that they use because I do it in high school too, is grip strength. Now, my muscles that are here in my wrist, when they're flat, that's resting length. I can squeeze onto something really strong when they're at resting length. If I change the length and then I try to squeeze, you can't generate as much force. If I lengthen these muscles like right here, by flipping it back and squeeze on something, you can't generate as much force. When your muscles are at normal resting length is when you can generate the most force. And you do a cool little thing where you just squeeze and change. That's showing the same thing. This is kind of just showing if your muscles are at their normal resting length, they're not shortened, they're not stretched out, you can generate the greatest force when they're at about resting length. Now, how fast, the velocity, and how long you can contract is influenced by what type of muscle fiber type it is, the load, how heavy something is you're lifting, and recruitment, how many motor units you're recruiting. Some of this is kind of common sense, but we haven't talked about muscle fiber type yet. Now, there are about 3 different types of muscle fibers, and there have 1 or 2 of these different words. We classify muscle fibers based on how fast they can contract. If a muscle fiber is really fast, we just call it a fast fiber. If it contracts really slow, we call it a slow fiber. Makes sense? It's just based on how fast the ATP enzymes can break down ATP. If you can break down ATP and release energy very quickly, you can contract very quickly. Some of it has to do with electrical activity in those muscles, but some muscle fibers in your body can contract faster than others. Some people are born with more faster contracting fibers than others. This is why I'm like, even if I trained every day, morning through night, am I ever going to be a marathon sprinter or an Olympic sprinter? No. I'll never be an Olympic sprinter. I have no genetic history of Olympic sprinters. No one in my family are, good at it. Genetically, I was not born with a large quantity of fast twitch fibers, as they call them. Other people are, and it's true. There are people. I'm like, since a lot of it is how many fast fibers versus how many slow fibers you have. It's genetic on what you're born with. This is why there are certain countries, with the certain genetics that are naturally good at sprinting, and other ones that are more naturally good at, say, marathons. And I'm like, and you'll see that when you get to the Olympics, who are the winners, who aren't. A lot of that is genetics. And I'm like, if your parent was an Olympic sprinter, you're probably going to be a really fast sprinter, even if you don't win the Olympics. So that's some fibers just contract faster than others. This is why I blame myself. I'm like, it's my family's fault. It's my parents. Always blame it on your parents if you're not an Olympic athlete. The other part that can affect how fast your muscles contract is how they generate ATP. Some of these fibers, slow or fast, could be oxidative fast fibers, which means they primarily rely on aerobic pathways, or that's where they get the oxygen, or glycolytic fibers, which means they're more using anaerobic glycolysis, hence glycolysis. So some fibers rely on an oxidative, or they're oxidative fibers. They generate lots of slow ATP. Glycolytic, this is where you're going to have, more of the sprinting. They can use that anaerobic process, make lots of ATP quickly, but they're not really efficient for going long term. So we put these fibers together. And we have what are known as slow oxidative fibers, fast oxidative fibers, and fast glycolytic fibers. Now, my little note, you can control, because it was genetically determined, how many slow twitch fibers and how many fast twitch fibers you have. That's genetically determined. Blame your parents. How those fibers can get ATP, they can switch from a glycolytic to an oxidative with training. And I'm like, or they can switch back the other way with training, whether you're training for sprinting or whether you're training for marathon running. That can change a little bit. Now, my little note, because I'm going to have you write some stuff down over on the side. I'm going to compare, and then I'll do the one in the middle. Slow oxidative fibers. Again, it contracts slow. It needs lots of oxygen. Again, it's an oxidative fiber. It uses oxygen. It contracts slow. It makes ATP slow using oxygen. Because it contracts slow and makes lots of ATP at a slow pace, it also fatigues slow. So people that are born with lots of slow fibers that like to undergo oxidative processes, these are your marathon runners. I'm like, they contract slow, but it doesn't matter. They're using lots of oxygen. They can make lots of ATP to replenish as they go, and they can run marathons. Now, they also have lots of mitochondria. What do mitochondria do? Make ATP. So they have lots of mitochondria, so they can use that aerobic oxidative process. This is all slow oxidative. And they also have a lot of substance known as myoglobin. Now, myoglobin, close. And I'm like, it is in muscle, but it's an oxygen-binding pigment in muscle. There is an oxygen-binding pigment in blood, that's hemoglobin. But this is an oxygen-binding pigment found in muscle. Now, myoglobin is a red color. So if you have a lot of red myoglobin in your muscle actually appears red or a darker color. Now, well, we'll get into it again. I'm jumping ahead of myself. In my mind. So that's slow oxidative. Lots of myoglobin, lots of that oxygen-binding pigment. It can contract slow, but it can contract long periods of time in an oxidative aerobic environment. The opposite is that fast glycolytic. I'm skipping to the third one there. The fast glycolytic is the opposite. It contracts fast, hence its name, but it will fatigue fast. Because it's goes through glycolysis, it does not require oxygen, and it has few mitochondria. Because glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria, so it has very few mitochondria. It also has very little myoglobin, that red oxygen pigment. It has very little myoglobin. So very little of that red pigment. So we actually consider this, if we look at it under microscopes, and like, although it doesn't always look white, we consider this a white type of muscle. You know, red if it has got lots of that slow oxidative because it lots of myoglobin. If it does not have lots of myoglobin, we consider the muscle white. Now, when you guys order chicken, what kind of meat do you guys like? White meat? Dark meat? I like dark meat too. Now, this is where it comes from. White meat, dark meat. Lots of myoglobin, not lots of myoglobin. What parts of the chicken have lots of myoglobin? The legs and the thighs. That means those muscles in the legs and the thighs, those are slow oxidative fibers in there. Those chicken can run around that field for hours. However, in a chicken, where you find in the breast meat and the wings, they have fast glycolytic. They can flap for a little bit, but do chickens fly? No, they're not flying for miles on end. And I'm like, they can do their kind of little flap, but that tires quickly. And so I'm like, it just has to do with white meat, dark meat. It's just the type of muscle fibers that are found in there. Makes you think next time. Now, what do you think fast oxidative fibers are? Based on its name? Yeah, and I'm like, well, they're kind of right in the middle. And I'm like, they do contract fast, which means they could fatigue fast. But they do undergo an oxidative process, which means they have lots of mitochondria, which means they can generate lots of ATP. What color do you think they are? They're pinkish. They got a little bit of myoglobin, not a lot. A little, or nothing, you know, kind of right in the middle, so they call them actually like pink fibers. So they're kind of like that in-between, intermediate. Now, most of the muscles in your body have a mixture of these different types of fibers. And I'm like, some have higher concentrations of one or the other, but that doesn't mean your thighs and your legs, like on a chicken, only have slow oxidative. They're going to have some fast glycolytics so that if that chicken needs to sprint and run away from you, can. And I'm like, so there's usually a combination. There's going to be, you know, some range of contractile speed, how fast eventually those muscles, you can only run so fast. You know, and depending on how many you have of one versus the other, some, you know, are going to cause you to fatigue faster than others. My other little notes, but in a motor unit, you know, one neuron that controls multiple muscle fibers, all of the fibers in any particular motor unit are the same type. So if you've got one motor neuron controlling just 3 muscle fibers, those 3 muscle fibers that are controlled are either all going to be slow oxidative, they're all going to be fast glycolytic, or they're all going to be fast oxidative. And your genetics determines the individual's percentage of each, whether they're fast, slow. You can blame your family. I always yell at my husband for this because he can be one that just gets up one day, I'm going to go run 5 miles, and literally just go run 5 miles out of the blue. Genetics. I can't. That would take me months to ever run that part. I'm going to say, I'm like, this kind of sums it up. This showing, you know, red, pinkish red, white, whether it fatigues fast, slows fast, all that fun stuff. Load, how it contracts your duration, how it contracts how fast you contract. This makes sense. Muscles contract faster when there's no load. Your muscle, if your biceps can control a whole lot faster, if you're lifting nothing in your hand versus lifting a 10-pound weight. If there's no load, your muscles contract faster. The more you have to lift, if you increase the load, the longer the latent period for all you recruiting all these muscles, the slower the contraction, and the shorter the duration. You can't lift a 10-pound, you know, weight for very long versus when you lift nothing. Make sense? Okay. And then recruitment. The more, you know, recruiting of motor units, and I'm like, is the faster the contraction with the more, you know, motor units and the longer the duration. You know, it's one of those, if you want to get something done faster, you recruit more people. Same thing. If you want to, you know, muscle contract faster, you recruit more muscle fibers. And you can do that for a longer period of time. More muscle fibers you've contracted. Now, some adaptations if you exercise. If you exercise doing lots of aerobic exercise, you know, lots of running, lots of biking, whatever, what will happen as you do this, you're going to have more muscle capillaries. Why do you want more of those? More oxygen from the blood. You're going to have more mitochondria. Why do you want those? More ATP. And you're going to have more myoglobin. What's myoglobin do? Yeah, it makes it red. I'm like, and it binds to oxygen in the muscles. So with lots of aerobic endurance exercise, You're going to eventually have greater endurance. You can run for longer periods, greater strength, and you're going to have more resistance to fatigue. You're not going to be tired after the first block. And some of your fast glycolytic fibers can start turning into fast oxidative fibers. They're still fast. That's genetically determined. However, how your fibers generate ATP can change. They can go from more of an anaerobic type fiber and start making more ATP in an oxidative environment. Now, if you're more of a resistance type person, you just want to lift weights all day and never run or do anything, it leads to a muscle hypertrophy. Your muscles get bigger. The muscle fibers, those muscle cells get bigger. You have more mitochondria to make ATP. But the biggest thing that makes your muscles bigger is you have more myofilaments. You have more actin, you have more myosin, and all of that is found in those myofibrils. And so eventually you're going to have an increased muscle strength and increased muscle size, which is generally what people are going for when they're doing resistance exercise. Yeah. If you ever watch, like, I've seen a couple of them on, like, ESPN, like the actual muscle building competitions. It's gross. It's gross. I know. I don't know how you walk. I know. All right. Don't think about that picture too long. You're all going to be thinking about that all day. So any type of exercise program to increase, whether it's your weights that you're lifting or whether it's the length of, how far you're running, it's known as an overload principle. Anytime you want to push your muscles to increase doing whatever, whether you want them bigger, whether you want to run farther, we have to push them a little bit farther each time. It's called the overload principle. We have to force our muscles to work harder than what they normally are comfortable with to either increase strength or increase endurance. If getting up and running, a mile is easy for you, well, you're never going to increase that length unless each day you go an extra block. I'm like, you're overloading what you're comfortable with. You run an extra block, then you run 2 extra blocks, and I'm like, you're constantly pushing your body farther. If you lift 5 weights and you're comfortable with that, well, now lift 8 weights, and now lift 10. Eventually, your muscles adapt to those increased demands, and you have to push them a little bit farther. So you have to overload those muscles to produce gains, whether to run farther, whether to lift more. Most people develop injuries because they just don't have any rest in between. Like your muscles do have to rest and recuperate and reset themselves. Otherwise, you start to get injured muscles, whether it's because of running, whether because it's weightlifting. The best exercise programs alternate aerobic versus anaerobic because you're using lots of different fibers, using them in different ways. So you can go run one day, you lift the next day, and then alternate back and forth. Let me get through one more slide. I got to tape everything else in my office. Now, on an alternate side, if you're not doing any of that, you end up with something known as disuse atrophy. If you don't use your muscles whatsoever, it could be because they're immobilized. This could be you're in a wheelchair. Maybe you just had a cast put on because you broke your arm, broke your leg. If you are not using your muscles whatsoever, they start to decline. Your muscle strength can decline 5% a day if you're not using your muscles. So it happens quickly. If you've ever had a cast on, whether your arm or leg, all of a sudden you get out of the cast, it's like the weakest leg, weakest arm you've ever seen. It actually looks smaller because your muscles have atrophied. Without any neurostimulation in your muscles whatsoever, if your nervous system is no longer controlling your muscles, which can happen when you have spinal cord injuries, those muscles completely atrophy and connective tissue starts to replace muscle tissue. And so so people that have had serious spinal cord injury, they're in a wheelchair for 15 years, and all of a sudden they're like, but we found a way to fix that spinal cord injury. That person probably is still never going to walk because any muscle that was ever there is now replaced with fibrous tissue, and you can't go backwards. You can't go from a fibrous scar tissue to muscle tissue. So even if they could fix it, it's too late. That muscle tissue is gone, and so rehabilitation becomes impossible. So there is a time frame when you can really, get rehabilitated. Well, yes, but usually it still takes a while, even though your muscle strength declines, it's still muscle that's there. It still takes a while for it to flip over to actual scar tissue.